There are names history forgets, because they lost. There are names history remembers, because they killed. And then there are names it cannot bear to whisper, because they remind us of what we are not brave enough to be. He stood on the hilltop at dusk. The wind carried the scent of iron and ash. Below him, an army waited. Not his enemies. His own. Waiting for his signal to attack. To break through a crumbling city whose gates had already opened in surrender. Women, children, and old men had gathered in the square. They held white cloths, knees bent, heads bowed. But the signal never came. The man on the hill, the general, lowered his sword. And in that single act of mercy, he set in motion his own destruction. This is not the story of a battlefield. It is the story of a battlefield after the fighting should have ended. This is not the story of how a war was won. It is the story of what happens when someone chooses not to win. He was born into war. Not in metaphor. In blood. Eefs. First cries were drowned out by the thunder of hooves and the collapse of burning rafters. His mother carried him wrapped in linen soaked with her own blood. His father did not survive the siege. No one expected the boy to live. But he did. By the time he was 12, he could outmatch any instructor. By 20, he had led his own battalion. By 30, his enemies called him by name in their prayers. The kingdom loved him because he delivered victories, and feared him because he never lost. But inside, he remembered something the others had forgotten, what it meant to be on the ground, helpless, watching fire eat everything. It stayed with him not as trauma, but as a compass. He studied war, not for glory, but for control. He believed that if he understood it well enough, he could cage it. He could put rules around it. He could bring civility to carnage. And when his king summoned him for what would be his final campaign, he accepted. Not because he believed in the cause, but because he believed he could control how it ended. He was wrong. The war was not noble. It was not necessary, but it was desired. A neighbouring province had declared autonomy, not through arms, but through words. They asked for the right to govern themselves. They sent emissaries. They quoted shared scriptures. They invoked old treaties. But none of it mattered. What mattered was the pride of a king whose eyes had begun to dim with age, whose hands trembled on the arms of his throne. What mattered was that history would not remember him as the monarch who lost land. So he sent the general. "Bring me their surrender," he said. "Or bring me their ashes." The general nodded, but said nothing. The campaign was swift, too swift. He cut through outposts with precision. Not a single civilian died. Soldiers captured were treated, not executed. Roads were kept clear for refugees. Grain stores were preserved. The king began to suspect. Mercy was expensive. Mercy delayed victory. "Why do you not end?" The king wrote. And the general replied, "Because I want it to end, not begin again under a new name." The capital of the province fell open like a wound. By the time the general reached its gates, the defenders had thrown down their weapons. The leaders had come barefoot to meet him. They offered themselves in chains. They asked for forgiveness. The general met them. He did not kneel, but he did not raise his sword either. He told his officers, "No more killing." He ordered food for the hungry, blankets for the cold. He disarmed soldiers, but allowed them to return to their homes. He promised to record the names of all prisoners to ensure they were accounted for. When the sun rose the next day, not a drop of blood had been spilled. But hundreds of miles away, the king awoke to a different kind of battlefield, whispers. He let them live. He spared traitors. He slept among them like a brother. He would rather make peace than enforce loyalty. And worst of all, he has begun to speak as if he were king. The general returned to the capital weeks later, exhausted but composed. He brought records, raps, confessions, treaties signed by those who had surrendered. He bowed before the throne and declared, "It is done. They are ours, and they are alive." The silence that followed was not admiration. It was calculation. The king asked only one question. Did they suffer? The general looked up and said, no. That was the wrong answer. He was arrested that night. The charge was treason. The sentence, public humiliation, followed by execution. But the king knew better than to make a martyr. So instead of killing him, he erased him. They rewrote the records. They renamed the victory as someone else's. They claimed the enemy had been crushed, not spared. They painted the general as hesitant, even cowardly. His name disappeared from scrolls, banners, songs, but not from the minds of the soldiers who had followed him, and not from the people whose lives he had spared. The years passed. The kingdom marched on, winning other wars under bloodier banners, and in a distant village, a man with greying hair lived quietly under another name. He repaired roofs. He taught children to plant grain instead of sharpened blades. He spoke little. But every so often, a stranger would knock at his door. A soldier from long ago, a child who had grown up beneath his sword, a mother whose son had returned from the battlefield because of his command. They came not to thank him, but to remember him. He died in silence. But the stories did not. They moved from town to town like seeds in wind, and when one day, decades later, the kingdom collapsed under its own cruelty, those who rebuilt it named a square after a man whose name had been forbidden. They carved it not in stone, but in steel, because mercy, they said, should not be something that fades with time. He had not wanted to become a symbol. Symbols were for the dead, and he had spent his entire life trying to keep people alive. But symbols do not ask for permission. They are carved by absence, not presence. And sometimes the act of not killing becomes louder than all the violence in the world. In his final years, the general refused visitors. He knew what they came for: stories, testimonies, a glimpse of the legend. But he also knew that stories lie, even when they mean well. They turn people into icons. They polish the wounds. They erase the indecision. What he had done was not clean. It was not confident. It had not been easy. He had hesitated. He had prayed. He had walked the city alone that night, looking into the faces of strangers who didn't know whether to trust him or run. And when he gave the order to stand down, to let them live, he had done it with hands that trembled. Not from fear, but from knowing. Knowing that every man in history who chose mercy when he had the sword paid for it. The king outlived him by only 4 years. He died bloated and delirious, whispering enemies' names into the folds of his robe. He had spent his last years surrounded by flatterers and poisons. When the palace was finally overthrown by those he had once taxed into famine, the rebels found libraries filled with censored records, battle reports rewritten, names scratched out, faces redrawn. Among them, in a vault marked traitors, they found a single scroll. It was a copy of the general's final campaign map. Nothing about it was military. There were no troop lines, no kill zones, only circles, each one drawn around a village. Next to each circle, one word: spared. The rebels wept. Across the sea, the descendants of the conquered province told a different version of history. They did not say they were defeated. They said they were seen. Children were told stories of a man with silver hair who walked through fire without raising his blade, who touched no woman, harmed no child, stole no gold. A man who turned an army into a question. What if we don't? But not everyone remembered kindly. There were other generals who had waited decades for him to fall. They whispered that he had been weak, that a true warrior finishes the kill. They pointed to his exile and said, "See, mercy is suicide in slow motion." They built statues of themselves with blood-soaked swords. They wrote memoirs about total victory. And they never spoke his name. But history has a strange appetite. It forgets quickly, then hungers for the thing it buried. One winter, 50 years after the general's death, a child was born in the former capital. Her parents named her after the hill where the general had once stood. She grew up with the story of a man who had once chosen peace, not because he was soft, but because he was brave enough to stop. She became a teacher. And every year, On the anniversary of the day the gates were opened without blood, she lit a single candle in the town square. Not in mourning, but in defiance of forgetting. And still, the questions remain. Would the general's mercy have held, if the king had not destroyed him? But his methods have inspired a new way of rule, one where war was not the first tongue of disagreement. Or was his very existence a threat to a world that still believed power could only be proven through conquest? There are no answers, only echoes. And perhaps that is the curse of those who refuse to win. They teach us that another path was possible, then vanish before we dare follow it. Because history does not worship restraint. It celebrates domination. The ruins of empires are lined with statues of those who burned brightest, not those who stepped aside. But if you listen closely, beneath the marble and the myths, you can still hear another voice. The Wyatt. The humor. I could have won, but I chose to end it. His trial had lasted less than an hour. The verdict was already written. The witnesses were never called. And the law, which he had defended for decades with blood and discipline, bent quietly around the will of one man. He was accused of collusion, of undermining the crown, of sedition by softness. The word traitor was whispered like incense in the halls of judgment. But no one dared speak too loudly, because some remembered what he had done, what he had not done. And that silence, the absence of testimony, became the loudest confession in the room. They sentenced him not to death, but to disappearance, because to kill him would risk making a monument. And tyrants fear monuments carved in memory more than those carved in stone. They exiled him to the northern borderlands, a stretch of wilderness too cold for war, too far for news, too quiet for uprising. They gave him no soldiers, no title, no coin. Only a name erased from every ledger. He built his own shelter. He fished. He planted. He taught the sons of farmers how to read by candlelight. They called him Old Hawk, a name whispered by children who didn't know he had once commanded 10,000 men. One winter, a group of travelling monks passed through his region. They sought shelter. He offered warmth. They asked no questions. He gave no name. But on their last night, one monk asked him, "Do you believe mercy wins?" The general stared at the fire, then answered, "No, but it remembers." The monk nodded, then added, "Remembering is its own kind of victory." Decades passed. Empires shifted. The king who had cast him out was long dead, his son assassinated by his own guard. The throne passed into obscurity, a relic of a time too tired to sustain itself. But in distant provinces, something had changed. Where once warlords reigned, schools began to open. In one city, a city that had once knelt before the general's sword, a monument was erected. It was not large. It bore no name. It was a simple bronze statue of a hand holding a sheathed blade. Beneath it, a plaque reared, "To the one who could have conquered us and chose instead to let us stand." Not all remembered kindly. There were those who still clung to the old songs, the ones that praised decisive blood, clean victory, swift vengeance. To them, he was a shadow, a softness, a crack in the myth of power. They feared what he represented. Because if mercy could lead, if peace could win hearts, what then of the legacy built on screams? What then of all the men who had justified their cruelty as necessary? There was a scholar once, a young woman named Selin, who spent her life piecing together the missing fragments of his life. She travelled through burned libraries, cracked scrolls, interviews with aging soldiers. Everywhere she went, there were holes in the records. But there were also stories. An officer who remembered how had saved children before sieging a town. A midwife who said he refused to burn a village because it had a school. A deserter who claimed the general once forgave a soldier for disobedience, not because he was weak, but because he understood fear. Celine collected these like seeds. When she died, her final manuscript was titled "The Victory That Was Not Allowed." It was banned in 3 provinces. But that's the thing about ideas. They don't burn well. And legends? They grow in shadow. In time, the general's image began to appear again. Not in royal records, but in the margins. graffiti in the ruins of fortresses, ink sketches on the walls of prison cells, a child's drawing tucked into the folds of a bread sack, a man with grey hair and a sword untouched, always watching, always not striking. The resistance, when it finally rose again, did not name itself after a battle. It named itself after a moment, the hill where the sword lowered. They asked nothing of their recruits but this vow: when you have the power to destroy, choose instead to rebuild. When you have the chance to command, choose instead to listen. And when history demands blood, demand a different ending. Not long after the resistance began its quiet swell, a child stood on the hill where it all began. There was no plaque there. No ruins. The trees had grown back. Time had tried to pretend that nothing had happened. But the child, no more than 11, carried a small piece of parchment. On it was a single sentence, copied by hand from an old teacher who once whispered stories after dark. The sword that was never swung is heavier than all those that were. He read it aloud. Thus, softly. Then buried it under a stone at the base of the oldest tree. That was how they began to mark the sacred places. Not with flags, not with temples, but with words hidden like seeds. Because mercy does not raise its voice. It waits. Somewhere, in a monastery high in the eastern cliffs, a debate was recorded between two monks. One, an old scholar of warfare, the other, a former conscript who had fled the capital long ago. The elder said, "Mercy delays justice." The younger answered, "Or perhaps it is justice, just not the kind we're trained to want." The elder replied, had he struck when they knelt, there would be no uprisings today. The younger asked, and had he struck, would you be here debating this or buried among them? The scroll ends with the words, when men forget how to kneel without demanding submission, they confuse surrender with weakness, and kill the ones who show them a third way. There was a time, centuries later, when the general's story was thought to be myth. University professors argued whether he had ever existed. Some said he was a composite, a morality tale dressed in armour. Others insisted he was a fabrication of dissidents. But every now and then, something surfaced. A rusted sword, found in the riverbed near the capital. No blood on it. No markings of war, but perfectly preserved and wrapped in linen with foreign script. A journal from a deserter, mentioning a commander who feared silence more than battle cries. A lullaby sung in a dialect nearly extinct, whose chorus translated to, "He could have broken us. He chose not to." No one could quite explain these artifacts, and yet no one could dismiss them, because something in them rang too human to be wholly invented. They say the final proof came not from an archive, but from a dream. A woman, one of the Resistance's last surviving members, awoke one night weeping. She was nearly blind, a memory fading. But in her sleep, she said she saw him, not in armour, not on a horse, but standing beside a river bank at sunset, washing blood from his hands. He looked at her and said, "Tell them I did not stop because I was tired. I stopped because no one else would, and someone had to." She died the next morning, but her words were passed down. They became the new code of conduct for those who resisted brutality with breath instead of blade. Not long after, a school was built near the hill. Its motto was etched above the door, "Let them remember the man who fought not to win, but to stop the war from needing to be fought again." Children were taught that history is not just written by victors. Sometimes it is survived by the merciful. There were still critics. They wrote essays. They filled symposiums. The general was irresponsible, they said. He jeopardized morale. He betrayed his duty. He gave hope to the enemy. To which an old scribe reading quietly in the back of one such gathering finally stood and said, "And yet centuries later we are still talking about him. Not about the ones who won." One day a traveller from a far western empire arrived at the edge of the old lands. He was a historian by trade, the kind who believed only in what could be measured, weighed, preserved in ink. He had heard rumours, the man who never struck, the hill of spared lives, the vanished general, but dismissed them as folktale. Still, curiosity does not need faith. Only time. And he had both. He visited the old villages, sat with the elders, read crumbling diaries in forgotten tongues. He saw nothing carved, nothing official, no proof. But everywhere he went, one thing stayed the same. When he asked about the man, the villagers would not say his name. They would only press their palms together, bow once, and say, We are still here because of him. The historian returned home and published nothing. Instead, he named his son after the wind that passed through the hilltop trees, because even he, a man of parchment and evidence, had seen something that could not be footnoted, a quiet so deep it must have been carved by restraint. Years later, when the kingdom's ruins had become pilgrimage sites, a letter was discovered buried beneath what remained of the central library. It was unsigned, unsealed, written in unadorned script. It read, "Perhaps my greatest failure was not that I spared them, but that I did not teach others how. I believed my act would ripple, that others would see what I saw, that the face of a kneeling man looks just like ours. That blood spilled becomes memory, but blood spared becomes lineage. I was wrong. I left too, quietly. I should have spoken louder. But perhaps you will." There was no name on the parchment, but no one who read it doubted who had written it. And still, centuries after his death, the world continues to ask, can mercy survive power? Can empathy govern nations? Can restraint be remembered, even when it leaves no monument behind? His life offers no answers, only proof that the question is worth everything. They say on clear nights, you can still hear wind sweep across the hill where he stood. It whistles softly through the trees, a sound almost like breath held in suspense. A sound that, if you listen long enough, begins to form words, not orders, not declarations. Just this, you do not have to destroy them to win, you only have to not become them. There is a final record found not in any state archive or royal chronicle, but on a wall carved into the foundation of a forgotten home. It was likely etched by hand, long after the general had disappeared. Perhaps by someone who served under him. Perhaps by a child who had once been spared. It reads, "He taught us what strength is, not in how he fought, but in how he stopped." In a coastal monastery far from where the general had walked, a new tradition was born. Each year, on the day historians believed he had chosen silence over the sword, monks would take a single blade ceremonial, dull, and pass it from hand to hand. As they held it, they were instructed not to speak, but to feel its weight. Some cried. Some trembled. Some bowed. Because it is one thing to hear of restraint. It is another to touch what was never swung. One monk, young and skeptical, once asked the abbot, "Why honor a man who lost everything for a choice that history barely remembers?" The abbot replied, "Because history remembers the wrong things loudly, but truth remembers quietly through the lives that were not taken, through the children who were born, because one man chose not to end their fathers, through the silence that did not become ash." Years passed. Generations turned. The kingdoms fell. New powers rose. Technology advanced. Flags changed. Languages blurred. But still, in certain places, under candlelight or in the minds of those who believed in mercy more than myth, the general remained. Not as a man, not as a warrior, but as a possibility. A moment in history when someone could have crushed, burned, erased, and chose not to. In a world that prizes domination, where leaders are still measured by the wars they win, and people still fear being seen as soft, his story lingers like an unfinished letter. What if we stopped just short of vengeance? What if power was measured by what we refused to do? What if leadership meant leaving people whole, not broken? The general never gave speeches. He left no memoir. No statue bears his face. And yet, in schools that teach both strategy and sorrow, his name is whispered. In homes built by those who survived past the age of war, his story is told. And in every act of leadership where someone chooses compassion over conquest, he walks again. Not as ghost, not as legend, but as a quiet breath behind the decision to stand down. Because in the end, he taught us something empires never will, that the strongest man on the battlefield is not the one who takes the hill but the one who walks away from it. Somewhere, far from the kingdoms and cathedrals, a child writes a story in the dirt with a stick. She doesn't know his name, but she knows what he did. A mother once told her, "You are here because a man with a sword chose not to use it." The child asks, "Why?" Her mother smiles and says, "Because he had already won."